In case you're one of those people that notices the detail, we had the naming of Jesus on the front and the gospel of the presentation of Jesus in the temple. Today's gospel is today's gospel, the naming of Jesus is tomorrow. And in my pre-Christmas confusion, we have many traditions brought together today, but I'm going to talk a little bit about the gospel. It is, as I said, the gospel of Jesus being presented in the temple. It's a feast day that we will celebrate in about a month. This first Sunday of the Christmas season, we continue the story that affirms the identity of this newborn child. This child, uniquely significant to, prophesied and promised with a very particular tradition of Judaism. As Christians, we now have a tradition we follow that witnesses the following of that tradition. As we listen to the gospel, we hear repeated that by this ritual, Joseph and Mary acted according to the law of Moses, as it is written in the law. According to what is stated in the law of the Lord, they did what was customary under the law. We hear also that the Holy Spirit rested on Simeon, that the Holy Spirit revealed, guided, and promised to Simeon. This meant Simeon had expectations. He looked forward to the consolation of Israel and to seeing the Lord's Messiah before he died. Each character in today's gospel, Joseph, Mary, Simeon, and Anna, chose and choose to make themselves subject to the law and to the traditions associated with the law. These promises of divine revelation are made. The active presence of the Holy Spirit that directs and companions is known to those who keep the law, who choose to reside within the boundaries of tradition, who consider and interpret the world as a place where God is, a place where God acts. Let me ask you, does the tradition permission those within it to see divine imprint? Does it provide a structure that releases the potential for those within it to act in accord with divine call? Which is not to suggest that God is limited to the boundaries set by tradition or only acts within them, simply that those within the tradition look for God and expect that which God promises to be made real. If we consider tradition like this, it seems a positive thing. It permissions and provides a useful structure and releases the potential of those within it. But I'd like to suggest it is more common these days for tradition to be regarded much less favourably, especially when it comes to church. The idea of being obedient and faithful to tradition is considered outmoded and suspect. Tradition might be seen to entrap or prevent or stymie innovation. Tradition is from back then and not in touch with the demands of now. So traditional church practice, ritual, language, and music can be seen as formulaic and stilted, innovating rather than energizing. And all of this makes traditional church seem inaccessible and almost incomprehensible to the uninitiated. Now I'm making an assumption or two that many of us are here because there's something about the tradition that we quite like, dare we say it. There's something about it that is of value, while also acknowledging it does need translation to be relevant. And that's for those of us inside the walls. How does it get translated from inside the walls to the majority of people who are outside, so that the stories we tell that we think have significance and are of worth continue to be told and echoed in the world? Now, we could probably spend a lot of time debating this. We could seek that elusive, authentic expression that lends us certainty to name that that's true, that's the tradition. But to what end and for whom? Experience of what makes for effective communication would suggest rather that translation is best done by example, that it is revealed through the way we act and the way we are. As we interpret the world as a place of God presence, we expect encounter, and we expect that we will make it real in the world, and we will act. We will be people who align our ways with ways of being that bring and nurture life. But I know also that it is really hard to translate, just as it's hard to teach, if we're not too sure how much we actually know. In fact, we realise that we're not particularly well educated in the way of tradition, and if we don't really understand why things are done the way they are, then it's hard to translate the tradition into practice and the language of our everyday. It's hard to live differently if we're not quite sure what that means. If we haven't quite figured out how to make this religious tradition stuff make sense in our world, as we interact in today's world, it'll be a struggle for our faith practice to be purposefully alive. Perhaps I might share an example. I was once asked, in a previous situation I was in, to explore the idea of providing a place for people to spend some time where they could reflect on the significance of Easter. And they wanted to do this by having a series of floral displays that reflected the Stations of the Cross. Now, I know about the tradition of the Stations of the Cross, but I'm not familiar with it, and I have to be honest, I'm not quite sure I get it. I also think flowers are lovely, but I couldn't quite make the connection. But at that same time, I was spending a lot of time working amongst some people who were in really struggling social circumstances in an environment that was really tough. And I thought, what would it mean to them? What would the Stations of the Cross stuff mean to them? Or is it just a tradition for people of privilege, which would kind of deny what we say is important about this faith we walk? So I thought, here's an idea. I'll ask some of the young people who are great artists in the form of graffiti if they could create artworks as a backdrop for these floral artworks. It was immediately apparent that significant translation about the Stations of the Cross would be required, because religious rhetoric sure was not going to cut it. So I thought about that first station. How many of you know what the first station is? Jesus is condemned. Yeah? However we imagine this, I think we think of it as happening back then, over there somewhere. As people of faith, we say that Jesus was unique. Therefore, this drama is unique and its significance. The Pilate condemning scene is a one-off historical event, surely, that happened back then only once. But think about what happens in the scene. Crowd behaviour, fear, misinformation, prejudice, power, and the innocent are condemned to death. Think for a moment of our world, full of ethnic and religious and sectarian conflict, where innocent people are slaughtered from accusations that require no proof. Or scenes where people of certain religious or ethnics or races are the first to be accosted and accused. It's apparent that prejudice distorts just process, and innocence is certainly not assumed. For some of these young street artists, this would be quite familiar. So if we consider the first station, which is part of a tradition this way, we realise that the challenges to faithful living are not back then over there. They are real and alive now as much as ever. So if we take that as an example, how do we indwell our faith and that tradition that this expresses, so that we are guided, our thinking and our acting is informed, and our practice of daily living is intentioned, so that when somebody looks at us, they see the gospel translated? When you embarked on your journey of faith, acquired a tradition perhaps, where did you expect that it would take you? Because I think we do have expectations, or I think we should have expectations of our faith, that somehow it will change us and that we'll go somewhere on a faith journey. Those who are starting out may be quite happy to discover the stories of the tradition, like the Christmas story of the special Jesus baby birth. But they also need an idea that there's somewhere to go, and there's a means by which to go. A map of the territory, if you like, with landmarks and places and points of recognition. Do you remember the dot-to-dot puzzles? Yeah? I was the youngest of 5 and I always got the dots muddled. I discovered what happens when you don't join the dots as you're meant to. Put in perspective of religion, or at least a religion that's had some continuity over time, there are dots that, when joined, provide us with a bigger picture map of faith journeying. A map that's emerged from those who've journeyed before us. Such wisdom, lived experience of God journeying in life, affirmed across time. I think it is these things that form our tradition with a big T and our traditions with a small. You see, I see traditions not so much as rigid forms from which we stray at our peril, but as pointers, as dots, as borders and boundaries on a map. And I think we need the guidance of such maps. It requires a certain discipline, a decision to be faithful and obedient, like Mary, Joseph, Simeon, and Anna, to subject ourselves to tradition's guidance. And uncomfortable though it may be, discipline tends to be beneficial to growth and maturity. It may be more palatable if we learn about, so come to understand, the why of the landmarks on the map. I found this piece by C.S. Lewis that I loved. He's actually talking about theology, but I think it applies to tradition. It goes like this. In a way, he says, I can quite understand why some people are put off theology. I remember once when I'd been giving a talk to the RAF and an old, hard-bitten officer got up and said, I've no use for all that stuff. But mind you, I am a religious man. I know there is a God. I felt God out alone in the desert at night, the tremendous mystery. And that's just why I don't believe all your neat little dogmas and formulas about God. To anyone who has met the real thing, they all seem so petty and pedantic and unreal. Now, he says, in a sense, I quite agreed with the man. I think he'd probably had a real experience of God in the desert, and when he turned from the experience to the Christian creeds, I think he was really turning from something quite real to something less real. In the same way, if a person once looked at the Atlantic from the beach and then goes and looks at a map of the Atlantic, they will also be turning away from something more real to something less real, from real waves to a bit of coloured paper. But here's the point. The map is only coloured paper, but there are two things you have to remember about it. In the first place, it is based on what hundreds and thousands of people have found out by sailing the real Atlantic. And that way, it has behind it masses of experience just as real as the one you could have had from the beach. Only, while yours would be a single isolated glimpse, the map fits all those different experiences together. In the second place, if you want to go anywhere, the map is absolutely necessary. As long as you're content with walks on the beach, your own glimpses are far more fun than looking at a map. But the map is going to be more use than walks on the beach if you want to get to America. Doctrines are not God, they're only a kind of map. But that map is based on the experiences of hundreds of people who really were in touch with God, experiences compared with which any thrills or pious feelings you or I are likely to get on our own are very elementary and very confused. And secondly, if you want to get any further, you must use the map. You see, what happened to the man in the desert may have been real, but nothing comes of it. It leads nowhere. There's nothing to do about it. You won't get anywhere by looking at maps without going to sea, and you won't be very safe if you go to sea without a map. Tradition is a map to companion and guide us. It does a few things. It asserts that there is a territory to explore where God dwells. But also that in each moment we choose as to what we see as possible, as to how we understand and interpret what is taking place in our world and what we do to respond. What is more, we discover we are not alone. There have been other people who have walked this way, and we have companions right now who are walking with us and know this journey too.